Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Why the Operating System Matters for Digital Transformation with SAP S4 HANA, hosted by SAP Insider and presented by SUSE. I'm Robert Holland from SAP Insider, and I will be your moderator today. Just a couple of announcements before we begin. This is a pre-recorded webinar, but we invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. At the conclusion of the webinar, the questions will be collected and we will ensure that they are all answered. Following the webinar, you will receive an email with details on how to access the recording on demand. And that email will include information on how to access the slides from today's session. Now, on to the presentation. Discussing today's webinar will be Stephen Mogg.
Hello.
Stephen is a public cloud solutions architect at SUSE, and Sherry Yu. Sherry is the global director of Cloud Success Architect for SAP at SUSE. Sherry and Stephen, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So in today's webinar, Sherry and Stephen are each going to present a different customer story showing lessons learned, benefits, challenges that the customers had moving to different public cloud environments. Stephen is going to tell us a story about a customer migration to Amazon Web Services. Sherry is going to tell one for a customer that moved to Azure. And I'm just going to hand it over to you, Stephen, and let you jump right in.
Thanks very much. So I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about why SUSE and AWS and why customers make the move in the first place. So SUSE and AWS's partnership stretches back probably well over 12 years. So together, we were the first to offer customers the ability to move SAP onto the public cloud. Right? And that's because SUSE was the first Linux to be certified to run SAP on AWS. And like I say, that was all the way back in 2012. Now, because of that type of innovation and much more innovation since, we've actually earned a leading place in the SAP market with over 85% of all SAP HANA deployments running on a SUSE platform. And if you combine that with the flexibility and agility of running on a cloud platform such as AWS, it really can be a winning combination. Now, when it comes to agility, right, you'll normally find that SUSE releases capability, operating system capability to support new SAP products and new SAP features to the customer first, right? We're the first OS that is in line to release that type of thing. Alongside that, you've got AWS, who are constantly innovating new services to help transform some of those SAP processes as well. And at last count, there was well over 200 services to be able to support your journey to the cloud. Now, both companies also make customers a lot more agile by supporting multiple automation frameworks, right? And this allows you to deliver services to the business a lot faster and with consistent quality, which is always good. And then finally, SUSE helped build on the reliability of AWS's global infrastructure by providing unique high availability solutions for SAP deployments. So let's talk a little bit more about the customer use case. So my customer is a large energy producer, right? Now, their story will be similar to many others you've heard, but there are still things you can certainly learn. So I guess the first place to start is talk a little bit about where the customer's journey started from. So their existing environment was built 20 years ago or so, and over that time it's been upgraded and they've applied SAP support packs along the way, and they kept things going in that environment for 20 years, which has been great. But with the mainstream support for SAP ECC originally planning to end in 2025, the company had to come up with a plan on how to get to SAP HANA. Now, in that ECC environment, there was a huge amount of customization, both at the SAP level with a lot of ABAP customization, as well as in the Linux environment. So it's one of those kind of landscapes where there were lots of little Linux scripts which would do tiny bits of admin and tiny bits of housekeeping, and they kind of wanted to move away from that. So they needed this this new approach, right? So this was going to be more than just an SAP upgrade to a new bit of technology. It was using the customer's own words, it was a business transformation, right? They'd be doing many things differently when SAP was running on AWS than they were when it was running on premise. So the first thing they chose was, of course, to use AWS and take an IaaS approach to running SAP. The second was to remove a lot of that customization which they had in place. They'd effectively start from scratch, build from the ground up, and they wouldn't be porting anything over from the old system. Now, the last choice, which is more relevant to ourselves and to today's session, is that the company chose to standardize on SUSE Linux Enterprise Server for SAP for all their SAP systems. Now, what that provided was a standard OS across, like I say, all the SAP systems. It meant that the same team could support all the deployed environments, and having that consistent SLES for SAP deployment meant that all the SAP systems and all the EC2 instances, they had the same OS lifecycle, access to the same updates. They could use the same processes to manage all the instances, and it basically kept things very simple, kept things very consistent. So let's talk about some of the challenges and how the customer solved them. So one of them was DR, right? Now, on premises, as with most customers with an on-premise environment, you can only use the data center which you own or a data center which you have access to, right? It can be quite limiting, right? Now, with AWS, there was a whole host of new options. So with the AWS footprint covering a lot of geographies and a lot of regions, it provided a huge amount of choice to the customer as to how they could implement DR. So now they've basically, they make use of the AWS global landscape, and they've got deployments spread across the whole of North America, which is something they couldn't do before. The next challenge was high availability. So there was some functionality which the company had on premises, but they didn't have any high availability clusters. So the capability was limited onto how they could keep systems up and available to the business. Now with SUSE, they've actually deployed multiple high availability clusters across the AWS availability zones for a number of their SAP environments. So using a combination of the AWS AZs and the SUSE HA extensions, they've effectively now got two completely redundant zones with the ability to run the database in either zone. And that's something that they just couldn't achieve with their on-premises landscape. Now, the last thing on this slide is around the time that it takes to recover a database, perhaps in the event of a failure. So with the SUSE HA solution, it's able to recover a database in just a matter of minutes, rather than the much longer period of time with the on-premises solution. So the kind of the dramatic increase in the effectiveness of HA, the ability to fail over quickly and recover quickly, was really well received by the business. So there were some AWS benefits too, which I'll cover quickly. Any customer kind of making the journey to the cloud or making a move to AWS will probably recognize these, will certainly understand these. The first one was flexibility, right? So there was the usual case that there was no large upfront cost to build out new hardware or a new data center. They can spin up instances quickly, whereas before, again, quoting the customer, it could take potentially months to get new bits of hardware through the door in order to build a new system. And now they can get whatever they need in just a few minutes. Now, alongside that, they've also embraced automation. So the technical team at the customer has built a series of processes to enable them to build out new infrastructure with as little hands-on as possible. I guess one thing they noticed that when you're doing anything at scale, that's when you start to see errors creep in, right? So most Linux admins, at least in my experience, tend to be relatively clever people, as are the SAP basis folk. And they're always happy to change settings in the OS or change settings in the SAP system. But when you multiply that by 20, 50, or 100, you kind of start to lose track which instances have the new setting, which ones don't. And that's when you see errors creep in, and maybe some are missed, and you lose that consistent landscape. So with the automation they have in place, all the settings, even from the kind of the AWS data, such as the tags that you put on instances, they're all deployed and they're set up without error. And that also includes the OS settings as well. And the reason they can do that is because they made good use of the AWS automation framework. So that's now called Launch Wizard for anybody looking to try and automate their SAP deployment. Now, one very cool thing that they did was they integrated AWS's automation process with the customer's CI/CD pipeline so that they could put in a request, as long as that request was in reason, and they weren't trying to deploy 50 instances or something, that you could put in a request, get that authorized, and have that deployed with SAP on, with everything set up perfectly in around 20 minutes. And of course, the automation piece ensured that all the instances that were deployed had the correct and consistent configuration as well. So what about SLAs, right? So some customers choose not to deploy an HA solution, right? But at least in my book, it is really important to protect some of those single points of failure within an SAP landscape. And that's exactly what the customer chose to do. Now, yes, the database can be recovered manually, all right? But the key lesson that was learned along the way as part of this project is that HA can detect the failure very quickly. It can then act on that failure with no human interaction needed to do the recovery, right? And again, the important piece is that they're not losing any data along the way. So they've benefited from an HA solution with an RPO of 0 and an RTO of just a few minutes to deliver that recovery. Now, customers also think that HA is, as I've just described, is for when things go wrong. Something breaks and you have to do a recovery. But using HA is also about maintaining some of the SLAs you have in a business during regular maintenance. And sometimes that maintenance is not in your control. So think about the AWS cloud. So sometimes maintenance has to be run on the physical host or the network, which is connected to your instance. Now, because the customer had SUSE HA in place, they were easily able to work around that AWS maintenance by just pushing the database off to the secondary node in the cluster. And again, just a few minutes outage with, again, everything was automated, no great stress, just a very tiny outage to the business as they move things across. Then the next lesson they chose to share was one around testing everything. All right, so it was important to have confidence in the underlying systems on which they were building their SAP systems. So a thorough test of the cluster using the various different published scenarios that SUSE and AWS publish in our documentation was something that they actually worked through. So not only did it prove the cluster worked, which is kind of the primary goal, it also gave the operations team great insight and experience into how the cluster solution behaves and what happens during specific failures, which is great because that's not something you want to learn during a production outage. So that testing was quite important, both on to check things work, but on an educational level as well. And then finally, it was about where to put the HA solution itself. So again, some customers choose to do dev test and then roll things straight into production. And maybe that works, but often it doesn't, and maybe some things are missed along the way. So again, both the customer decided, as is best practice, is to have pre-production a pre-production environment in which to do your QA. You make that as similar as possible to production, and most people know that, but that also includes having that HA environment, which allows you to do a bit of testing there as well. So in terms of support and services, on the AWS side, the customer made good use of the AWS enterprise support during some of their planned maintenance activities as the system went into kind of the day 2 operations. But they also made use of the infrastructure event management, which is something you can wrap around key events. Now it's an AWS service, but more relevant today is probably some of the use of SUSE services. Now, SUSE offer a health check service. It's great for checking out clusters. It's great to ensure that you have everything set correctly and that everything is functioning before you do anything significant, such as go live, or even a little down the road when you're doing major upgrades or anything like that. So any significant event, you can often get SUSE in to do a quick health check in your environment just to give you that extra peace of mind. We also have a service that we call premium support, and that's where we provide a highly skilled engineer as a single point of contact into the SUSE support organization. There's somebody that's familiar with your business, familiar with your technical landscape, so that if there are any issues, you've got an individual there that knows you, knows your business, knows your landscape, and you can kind of get that accelerated support experience, which is great if issues are critical.
So just a quick question, Stephen. You sort of talked here about, SUSE Health Check services and leveraging those, at different times, not necessarily just during the migration. When is the best time to sort of engage SUSE services to sort of do that health check? And how long does it sort of normally take?
Yeah, okay, fair question. So the health checks can take 5 days. So we normally recommend about 5 days. It's going to depend on the size and the complexity of the environment, but 5 days is always a good start. What you might find is that within that 5 days, we potentially discover some issues which might need some remediation. And if you want SUSE to do that, that's obviously a little bit more time. So maybe usually somewhere in the 5 to 10 day region is where we would suggest. As for when to engage the SUSE services organization, definitely before you go live. Obviously, as I said, it's kind of during those key events. So either before go live or before any major operation that you might do in the life cycle of that landscape.
Yeah, it's obviously important to ensure that everything is configured correctly, everything is set up correctly, you haven't missed anything in what you're doing, and that's what that health check service is essentially providing for you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I think you kind of already answered this question, but you talked a little bit about premium support and having someone who understands your environment. And is that the difference between, for example, SUSE priority support and SUSE premium support?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying the correct thing. So both SUSE priority support and SUSE premium support are very good services. All right, we've got a lot of talented people at the end of both services. However, if you want that, we'll call it special treatment, but as I've said, it's just having that individual that truly understands you and your environment, and that's a lot quicker than going into one of 50 or 100 or so engineers that you might get if you just go into the priority support team.
Right.
That said,
yeah.
all individuals want to get you back up and running. It just might happen a bit quicker if you've got somebody that's effectively part of your team, your own IT team. So.
Right. You're accessing the same high level of resources from a support perspective. The difference is that with premium support, you have someone that is familiar with your environment and has, a knowledge about it that they might have from being a member of your own internal team.
Yeah.
I want to add one point here. If a customer consumes the SUSE subscription from the AWS Marketplace, and the L1 and L2 support will be provided by AWS support. A lot of customers, especially the large customers, chose to have a SUSE premium support because this is the way that they have a pointed contact directly from SUSE with expertise, for example, the high availability cluster expertise to directly help them to either review a roadmap or lessons learned, from other customers. So this is a very valuable customer support experience acknowledged by the hyperscalers. So in my portion, I'm going to talk about the customer story on Microsoft. But across the board among the hyperscalers that SUSE is working with, the support experience, including the health check and also the premium support, are highly recognized by the hyperscalers.
Okay, great.
Okay, thanks. So I guess if we could just pop back to the cost savings, thanks very much. So during the project, it was key to find the right cost model for the customer, and more importantly, the right process to achieve those savings as well. So with regards to the AWS infrastructure itself, many customers choose things like reserved instances, which are fine. I'm sure most customers are also aware of the cost savings plan that AWS have for the EC2 infrastructure as well. But that's just for the EC2 infrastructure. There's a whole set of discount plans available for the SUSE components as well, for the SLES for SAP operating system as well. Now, most customers make use of this, and this customer did make use of these, but we spotted pretty early on that these can be as these can be completely self-service, and they can be actioned on an individual kind of per instance basis. It can become a bit of a burden when you've got hundreds of instances which you want to activate a cost savings plan for. So that's where something called a private offer comes in and kind of helps reduce the administration around creating a large number of annual subscriptions for SLES for SAP. It's something you can work with your AWS account exec or SUSE, and we'll work together to ensure that you kind of get this nice, neat little package which provides you the best discount over a year to ensure that you're operating as cost effectively as possible. And then finally for me, I just wanted to talk a little bit about maintenance. We've kind of touched on some of this already. So again, remember that HA can help in many situations, right? We've discussed that HA's helping this customer maintain availability during some of the cloud platform events, right? Where those physical hosts are updated or need to be rebooted, and that affects the EC2 instance, which is running your SAP environment. But this also helps during some of the planned operations with the operating system as well. So take the ability to deliver something called a rolling update. So before an update to a system might take a few hours, right? By the time you take the system down, you patch it, you reboot it, you test it, maybe you patch the SAP system or the database on top of that, and then you test it again. It can be an hour or two before that system's restored, which can be quite an outage to the business. Now, the customer's making great use of some of the SUSE HA capability to do this rolling update, right? And that's where you can move the primary database to the secondary node in the cluster whilst you're busy patching, basically patching the node where the database isn't, right? So you're just basically ensuring that the downtime is reduced from, as I described, potentially hours to just a few minutes as you move the workload across. So basically, in terms of this customer experience, with better SLAs, they've got shorter outages for the business for both their planned and unplanned downtime. The customer is pretty happy with SLES for SAP. And that brings me to the end of this case study. So I'll hand you over to Sherry.
Yeah, thank you. So in this session, I'm going to talk about briefly the SUSE's partnership with Microsoft Azure. And SUSE has a cloud-first mentality in the engineering. That's why we always work with hyperscalers across the board, and particularly to Microsoft. SUSE is the #1 ACP solution provider on Azure with the largest market share, and world's largest ACP workloads are running on SUSE. And together with Microsoft, we jointly develop HA solutions and also help customers to deploy them. And as the result, so we have achieved, been supporting, multiple world's largest customer in different industries on Microsoft. And today's case that I'm going to talk about is in the retail business, and the customers has a legacy SAP instance to support thousands of stores, and over the years there are over 100 terabyte data to move to the cloud, and that covers various workloads from finance to supply chain, pricing, promotion, etc. And the customer decided to standardize on SAP S4 HANA, and the deployment is the largest in the retail space, the largest SAP S4 HANA deploying Microsoft. And the workload crossed across hundreds of virtual machines and over 30 HANA large instances. So that's the bare metal-based large instance types that support up to 24 terabyte. The customer has multiple database with a 24 terabyte HANA database, and they are running multiple clusters. to achieve the high availability and reduce business disruption. And also they standardize on SUSE for SUSE thought leadership, especially in high availability and also management solutions to achieve operational efficiency. And first of all, the first challenge is operational complexity. With a landscape at these sites, the customer needs a solution to help them quickly and reliably upgrade hundreds of instances. And they also need to perform cadence update for the security patches. And how can they avoid downtime during the patching process? And also there are risks that can be introduced by the human operational errors. So the solutions on Microsoft and the SUSE SUSE Manager and the live patching to manage the day-to operations. So SUSE Manager is SUSE's lifecycle management tool, and it provides a compliance check. And also the customers can consistently push patches to multiple instances without any gaps and inconsistency. And also live patching is here to help avoid downtime while doing the patching process. So for years, SUSE supported kernel live patching, but now we already added user space live patching as well. This is the user space live patching is an exclusive SUSE solution. The one typical use case is the glibc and the OpenSSL libraries. In the past, because those two libraries are common security vulnerabilities, that's why you want to patch them as often as possible. So in the past, after the patching, you have to reboot your instance that has a dependency on those libraries. And for large HANA databases, this would introduce a downtime. So with the help of a user space live patching and the kernel live patching as well, customers can do the patch, but to avoid a reboot for up to 12 months. And in order to reduce the chance of human errors, the customer leverages automation framework for SAP. It's a native service on Microsoft. Behind the scene, SUSE is a contributing partner to ensure that the best practices from SUSE side is followed. Because the automation framework can not only automate the SAP installation, but also the installation and the configuration of the HA clusters. So next challenge is the high availability. As I said, the customers are running world's largest HANA database in the scale-out environment. Up to each HANA node is up to 24 terabyte on the HLI instance. So this is the most complex HA scenario. And SUSE is a developer of the HA solution for SAP, especially the HANA scale out in pacemaker deployment. We started back in 2015. So by the time the customer start deployment, SUSE already built a very rich experience to help customers go live. And another challenge the customer had was the availability issue due to misconfigurations and human errors. So Robert, back to your question, when is a good time to engage SUSE services? So this is a good lesson learned, and the customer engage with a service, a system integrator, who is very experienced in SAP management. However, because the high availability configuration is so complex, and during the deployment process, there had been some misconfigurations that the system integrator couldn't solve on their own. So the SUSE team got put into the project, especially SUSE high availability experts who are the developers of the solution. And they help find the issues very quickly and propose the solutions. And so the lesson learned is, especially when you have very complex high availability setup, please engage SUSE services. And if you work with a system integrator, it's a good idea to engage SUSE for a health check before go live to make sure that all the best practices are in place so you can avoid any last minute surprise before go live. So another challenge is the monitoring. Yeah, because for landscape is large, the customer wants to gain a deep insight to be alert when minor issue happens, and also they want to be able to identify the root cause during the troubleshooting. And for this purpose, the customer use SUSE's project Trento. It's a feature that's part of the SLAS for SAP applications. It can scan the SAP deployment to validate the setups, especially for the high availability clusters based on the Azure infrastructure, and also monitor the clusters in the production environment. The value is that during the day two operations, sometimes after customization, there may be drifts in the configuration. And using Trento that does continuous monitoring and the check can help identify those drifts and to help customers avoid outage from accumulated minor issues, which is very common. Then the next challenge is they need ability to monitor not only the pacemaker cluster, but also the OS matrix and also the HANA database matrix, including the status of the HANA system application running in the cluster. And the customer built the monitoring implemented on the HLI instances in both production and the non-production, and they used the exporters. That's part of the SLAS for SAP. The exporters are built on open source technology, Prometheus. Then that exporters would feed those metrics into the monitoring framework that the customer implemented. So some of the key takeaways. The customer has been going in live in production for several years. And this is a long journey, and SUSE has been a critical part of this journey. So the key takeaways include scalability, monitoring, and automation. Those are the key components that the customer want to consider, from the design phase. And considering those factors during the design phase can help build a very strong foundation, for the SAP platform, and to ensure growth and reliability. And also the second takeaway is to invest in automation. So nowadays, especially for very complex landscape, automation is a very powerful vehicle to not only speed up the deployment, but also to ensure accuracy and consistency across multiple landscapes. And the third takeaway is to choose the right partner. And SUSE as the leader in the SAP space, especially in the HA space, SUSE is a developer of the HA solutions based on the pacemaker cluster. Choosing SUSE means that the customer has the opportunity to get support directly from the developers when complex issue arises. And it's also helpful, valuable to have a premium support engineer, especially if a customer has their SAP landscape managed and services by a third-party vendor. And the SUSE premium support would help them remain contact and get help directly from the developer of the solutions that they are running. And the last one is, to build a robust monitoring framework, because monitoring can help enhance the transparency and help gain insight into the complex landscape. what we have found, as I mentioned, a lot of outages are actually the result of accumulated minor issues that could have been identified and remediated in the early stage. So monitoring is a very powerful vehicle to help you stay alert. So last, call to action. If you have any question regarding running your SAP workload on either AWS or Azure, and you can contact SUSE to get help. Either you have some question on the cost optimization, and the cost optimization that Stephen mentioned is also available through Microsoft. And we also provide reserve instance discount to customers, similarly to what Stephen mentioned on AWS. So our staff would be happy to help you. And if you have any technical question, you are also welcome to contact SUSE. And there are several links down below. Please feel free to explore more from those resources.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry. And thank you, Stephen. Couple of quick questions before we wrap this up. For organizations that have like a multi-cloud strategy, or maybe you may be running SAP solutions on different cloud providers, and I know from some of the research that I do that is the case. You mentioned a few solutions here, SUSE Manager, SUSE Trento. Are they supported across hyperscalers?
Yeah, the answer is yes. So a lot of solutions that we mentioned here are part of the Celeste for SAP applications. And it's tested across the hyperscalers, AWS, Azure, and the Google Cloud. And SUSE always ensured a feature parity across the multiple clouds. And SUSE Manager is also used, are already being used by customers to manage a hybrid environment, including on-prem and across the multiple clouds. So we do have, in the previous SAP Insider series, we do have the second one is actually talk about SUSE Manager and Trento use case in details. So if you are interested, please check out the previous recording.
Yeah, and I can definitely confirm that was a very detailed and thorough presentation of SUSE Manager, and I learned a lot from it. So, now both of you mentioned the use of high availability solutions. You talked about using and correctly configuring HA solutions is one of the best things that you can do, and how there are big advantages, particularly when moving to these sort of environments, of how quickly things can be restored should that need to happen. I noticed you did share a couple of links on the previous slide, Sherry, but are there any best practices guides, recommendations, implementation guides that can perhaps be used by technical teams around high availability?
Yes, so there are several places, particularly to high availability. All the configuration guides are published on SUSE's website. So if you go to SUSE.com, and you can navigate to the best practice websites. And we recently published a reference document that's a list of all the supported HS scenarios by SUSE. So that's a very good one-stop reference. Then when it comes to the best practice on each individual hyperscalers, how SUSE engage with each hyperscaler is we release HA solution on-prem first. And then the hyperscaler would test and validate that setup, and then publish their own configuration guide on their own website. The reason why the hyperscaler needs to test each individual HA scenario is because the cluster implementation varies. It's highly dependent on the underneath infrastructure, and especially for the Stoneys device and the virtual IP, the implementation varies from hyperscaler to hyperscaler. So that's why, in order to make sure the whole stack works, each hyperscaler would validate and test the HA scenario and offer support based on the test results. The configuration guide is published on AWS and on Microsoft, respectively. So if if you go to their website, you can find the one-stop place for all the documentations related to SAP. And then you navigate from there and will be able to find out that configuration guide for the particular HA scenario that you have in mind.
Okay. Yeah, and I know that from research that we've done in the past, we sort of asked the question of organizations, who should you be talking to when you have HA configuration questions? And a lot of people look to the provider. They look to SAP, right? They look to their infrastructure provider. They look to their consulting partner. But at the bottom of the list, but perhaps one of the best resources for ensuring your high availability systems are configured correctly is the operating system provider, right? They have experience with setting up high availability environments across multiple infrastructures, and it's definitely worth ensuring that you talk to SUSE, when you're setting up high availability for your SAP environments. So one last quick question. For someone that's moving to the cloud, we're seeing a continued acceleration of cloud-based environments. When is the right time to start talking to SUSE?
Yeah, so I'll have a crack at that one. So you kind of touched on this already, but when customers move their SAP environment and they decide to migrate to the cloud, they'll spend a lot of time thinking about SAP. They'll spend a lot of time thinking about the cloud provider. They maybe don't give the OS too much thought in the middle, right? And to be fair, that's almost understandable. But there are a series of decisions which need to be made in terms of consumption model, cost optimization, how to deploy, which automation framework to use, and so on and so on. Even down to, well, when it's deployed, how are we going to kind of look after this environment? How are we going to patch it? What's our process to patch, upgrade, feed, and water this environment for the next 5 years? We've actually had customers that have got to deployment time and then they haven't figured out that second bit, which is quite scary. So I'll take the easy answer and I'll say as soon as possible in a migration. There's certainly things we can help with regarding the migration, but certainly before you deploy the first bit of landscape into AWS or Azure, that's the time to be talking to SUSE or a SUSE partner, just to get that third piece of the puzzle. And I think you already, both Sherry and yourself, touched on the fact that it's important to have a number of people or a number of partnerships with all the vendors in your landscape as well, and that does include the OS.
Yeah, great advice, Stephen. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. As I noted before, if you have a question, those will be collected and we will ensure that they are answered within the next few days. Shortly after today's session, you will receive an email allowing you to access the presentation on demand, along with this today's slide presentation. So on behalf of SAP Insider and our guests at SUSE, thank you for your time and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.